have with us today the Consul General from Chicago. This is, of course, the anniversary of the British Consulate in Chicago. We have the little pin here that I'm wearing proudly. The long history of the Consul Generalship in Chicago, and given the politics of this city, clearly being a Consul General from Great Britain or from the United Kingdom has not always been easy. But our speaker has a long and distinguished career in the in the service of his country. He also has a very prominent sister who I had lunch with last May, and learning her politics and her background, especially after reading Selden's biography of Tony Blair. It's a very interesting family, which I'm sure he won't talk about. But nevertheless, it is a great honor for us to have with us the Consul General from the United Kingdom, Andrew Seaton.
Thank you, Paul, for that introduction. Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for coming out this morning. I'm one of those people who is definitely a owl rather than a lark. I'm not one of those people who springs out of bed and is at my sparkling best early in the morning. In fact, a number of my staff will probably wondering precisely at what time of the day I am at my sparkling best. But anyway, it's certainly not in the morning, so thank you all very much for coming out to see me this morning. Thank you, Paul, for that introduction, and thank you to the City Club for inviting me. A lot of my work is to do with promoting links between Britain and the bit of the Midwest that I look after for the British government, in just about any area we can. As Paul said, we've been here as a consulate for 150 years. Despite appearances, I haven't been here quite all that time. But we work right across the Midwest promoting links in any area we can. On the whole, it's an extraordinarily positive atmosphere to be working in. People are very welcoming. Occasionally, they very politely show interest in what it is I've got to say, but are very keen to work with us. Not always true. I was in Ohio a couple of weeks back. Now, you'll remember that Ohio last year was what essentially where determined the outcome of the presidential election race. You may also remember that the Guardian newspaper in London, which is a certain sort of left-of-centre newspaper, ran a campaign urging its readers to write to voters in Ohio, urging them not to vote for President Bush. Well, quite understandably, in my view, there was a considerable outrage, not just in Ohio, but across the US at this sort of interference in the American democratic process. And one of the more printable emails that we received, if my memory is correct, said that people in Ohio and the US were not interested in the tea-sipping opinions held by yellow-toothed pansies in your worthless corner of the world. Well, that sort of put us in our place. But the City Club asked me to come and talk today about terrorism, specifically the attacks that took place this summer in London, and in particular what the response has been in Britain to those attacks, how we're responding to them, and so on. Can I say up front that we had here in Chicago and right across the Midwest a very heartwarming response to those attacks. We received hundreds of letters and emails and telephone calls, including from some faces I see in the room with us this morning, and it made us feel very much among friends here at a difficult time. The July attacks were the most serious terrorist incident ever to hit London in terms of loss of life. There have sadly been other attacks in the recent past, but this was the most serious, over 50 killed, over 500 casualties. And it's disturbing to think that if the attempted attacks just 2 weeks later, later in July, had been successful, then the casualties might have well been of the same sort of level. An immediate response in London, and I was there just a couple of days after, was, and I think a lot of commentators noted on this, a very strong sense of people just having to get on with their lives, of not being deterred, not being terrorized into changing what they were doing because of these attacks, And that, in a sense, was the most immediate and popular response to terrorism, and in a sense, the most effective. I think another thing that struck me about the attacks was that, just as with the attacks on the World Trade Center, of course, much, much bigger in scale, just as the attack on the World Trade Center wasn't just an attack on New York, an attack on America, so the attacks in London weren't an attack just on Britain or on London. The casualties included people of 19 different nationalities and of just about every faith you could think of: Christian, Hindu, Sikh, Muslim, and so on. And that casualty list itself symbolizes the sort of diverse society that London and Britain have now become. But it also symbolizes that the response to terrorism around the world isn't, as some would have it, something that divides the Muslim world from the non-Muslim world, but rather something that unites it. And this was shown in the very, very widespread condemnation we had from all shades of Muslim opinion to those attacks. Indeed, the British Muslim Council issued a fatwa after the attacks, saying that the attacks were crimes against all of humanity and contrary to the teachings of Islam. So the condemnation from the Muslim community itself could not have been stronger. And I think, in part, that was in recognition, and a very public recognition, that the Muslim populations are as much threatened by the activities of these people as anybody else. But following the attacks, although, as I said, the mood on the streets in London was very much one of kind of business as usual, getting on with life. But following the attacks, I think from the government's perspective, there was a sense that inaction was just not an option, that this represented such a ramping up of the threat to national security in Britain that something had to be done. Clearly, a part of that was the immediate policing and security response. And that's not for me to go into details of, but you'll have seen how quickly the four bombers involved in the 7 July attacks were identified, and that a number of arrests of those involved in those attacks have now taken place. And I think a lot of people noted, as an aside, the extensive use of closed-circuit camera television technology in identifying those responsible. I found it quite extraordinary that just 3 or 4 days after the attack, you could see on your television screen a picture of all 4 of the bombers going into the same station in England. It's just extraordinary. But in terms of the government's response, one element of that is changes to our law, changes to our framework of response to terrorism. About 3 weeks after the attack, the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, announced a number of new measures that the government was seeking to bring in. Firstly, new anti-terrorism legislation, and I'll come back to that in a moment or two. Second, a whole package of measures designed at tightening up the controls on foreign nationals considered as posing a threat to Britain, tightening up of border controls, in effect. And I think a lot of this reflecting concern in government, but also quite widely in the British population, concern over the activities of a small number of radical Islamic preachers and the impact that they were having on young Muslims in Britain, particularly young Muslim men. So as part of that package of stricter border controls, there are new grounds for deporting from Britain or expelling from Britain individuals who pose a threat to our national security. Grounds including fostering hatred, advocating violence, justifying terrorist violence anywhere in the world. Also, anybody who has been found to have been involved in terrorism anywhere in the world will automatically be refused asylum in the UK. Again, reflecting concerns that a number of those radical Islamic preachers have themselves been asylum claimers in the UK and are seen to have abused that asylum status. Another example, Muslim leaders in Britain are being consulted in respect to those Muslim clerics who are not British citizens to draw up a list of preachers who should not be allowed into the UK because of their extremist views. So all pointing in that same direction. So one part of the measure is tightening up border controls, tightening up access of people to the UK who we consider a threat. Another part of the measure is prohibition of a number of terrorist organisations. A number are already prohibited, prescribed, forbidden from undertaking any activity. About 25 or so Another 14 or 15 groups have now been added to that list. Another possibility, considering the power of closing places of worship that are being used as centres for fomenting extremism, a consultation paper has been issued on that, consulting the Muslim community and other religious communities, and that's now being looked at now. To come back, in a sense, to the centrepiece of this, the new anti-terror legislation, that is going through the House of Commons now. I won't run through the whole bill. It will take us from now till lunchtime. But some of the key provisions, introducing a number of new offences, a new offence of acts preparatory to terrorism, not linked to specific terrorist acts, but undertaking acts which the courts would determine are preparing for terrorist acts. That would be an offence. Secondly, a new offence of being involved in or providing or receiving terrorist training. Thirdly, a new offence of the encouragement or glorification of terrorism, not just in the UK, but anywhere in the world. Another new provision reflecting changing times, new provisions to counter the use of the internet in encouraging or inciting or glorifying terrorism. Another new provision, extending the detention period pre-trial for terrorist suspects, allowing them to be detained up to a maximum of 3 months to reflect the request from the police and security authorities that the greater time is necessary to allow for the difficulty of obtaining evidence, hard evidence, in these cases. As I said, a lot of other provisions as well, which I won't go into, but altogether a significant new package of anti-terrorism legislation. Now, no surprise, these new measures have given rise to a lot of debate and questioning in the UK in a number of different areas. But just to pick out 3 of them. First criticism, come on, why haven't you done all this before? You know, Britain's been soft on terrorism for the past 20 years. You brought this on yourself. But I think the one-word answer to that is nonsense. I mean, we've had comprehensive anti-terrorism legislation on the books for a long while, reflecting in part the impact of Irish Republican terrorism. But new terrorist tactics happen all the time, and our own legislation and protection, just as in the US, has to respond to that. And that's what these new measures are. A second line of concern, some are questioning whether these new measures infringe some of the basic human rights and safeguards built into the British system. And this raises some classic issues for liberal democracy. How far do you allow freedom to those who are trying to attack the very basis of your society? On the other hand, do you risk giving terrorists a victory if actually in response to their act, you start to change your practices and procedures? Very, very difficult issues which the US is grappling with, which many countries across Europe are grappling with, including the Netherlands, which has faced many of these same issues in different ways. You know, there isn't an all right or an all wrong answer here. There's no absolute freedom of speech, but similarly, there clearly have to be safeguards in place to make sure that in protecting a society, you're also protecting the rights of people in that society. So a very, very difficult area. And in Britain, as in the US, there's a very, very strong attachment to the principles of free speech. But also, I think that following those attacks in London, there is a sense of anger in some quarters that freedom of speech has been abused by a very, very small number of people to attack the society around them. But anyway, in putting forward this legislation, the government has made it clear that it does not involve moving away from its human rights safeguards. It continues to observe the provisions of our own human rights legislation and the European Charter on Human Rights. Those are some of the concerns around freedom of speech and liberties that are being very much discussed at the moment as the bill is going through Parliament. It shows what a sad social life I have, that I think it was last Thursday night I was watching C-SPAN. In fact, I think I was in South Dakota and therefore watching C-SPAN. and turn it on and happened to see it was our Home Secretary, sort of Secretary of the Interior, facing the House of Commons Select Committee on Home Affairs, being quizzed on the new legislation. And they were pressing him very hard on the new safeguards built into the legislation, on these precise questions of how far you move the boundaries in these areas. And later on in that same session, the House of Commons Select Committee were quizzing human rights groups, legal groups, and so on exactly the same issues. So there's a process in place here. And you know, in the nature of a democracy, one can't say at the moment quite where this legislation is going to come out. But certainly, despite all of that, the government clearly feels that it is absolutely necessary to update our legislation to make sure that we are able to respond better and counter better to the threats that we're facing. So that's the second area of concern. The third area of concern is about the proposals is that in some way they are directed solely at the Muslim community and are singling them out either expressly or by implication as being solely responsible for terrorism. And in putting forward the measures, Prime Minister Blair stressed that they weren't in any way aimed at the vast majority of the law-abiding Muslim community in Britain. But in recognition of these concerns, and also in recognition of the fact that the 4 bombers involved in the 7th of July attacks were British-born Muslims, which I think raised some quite difficult questions for our society. These weren't foreign-born radicals coming in. These were British-born and raised Muslims, 2 of the 4 in perfectly good jobs and so on. It raised some very difficult questions for our society about what are the factors that are leading to these people and their supporters, in a sense, having such hatred for our society that they want to destroy it. So some quite difficult issues. But as part of that, reflecting those concerns, alongside the package of measures I described on new legislation and so on, was a major new program of consultation with the Muslim community in Britain, trying to improve outreach to the Muslim communities and trying to improve integration of Muslim communities where that integration is not as close as it could be. And so the government, alongside the new legislative proposal, set up a number of Muslim-led working groups looking at those issues, looking at things like the education needs of Muslim communities, encouraging more integration of Muslim young people, looking at the training and accreditation of Islamic preachers. And in fact, as part of those working groups' work, a number of the leaders of the working groups came here to Chicago over Labor Day weekend to attend the US's biggest Muslim conference, the Islamic Society of North America conference, because the conference here was discussing many of those same issues: radicalization, better integration, education, and so on. And as we have found in so many areas of our work in the consulate, where we work very closely with Chicago, we're all, our societies, grappling with an awful lot of the same sorts of issues. None of us have got all the right answers. So it's very useful coming together of Muslims on both sides of the Atlantic here in Chicago. Those working groups have now reported to the government. Their recommendations include setting up a national council for imams and mosques, looking at the training of Islamic preachers, setting standards, setting best practices, looking at establishing a national forum against extremism and Islamophobia, putting in place a roadshow of popular young Islamic scholars to reach out more to the young Muslim community. Because one of the things that came through very strongly after the attacks was that while Muslim leaders in Britain were very, very fierce in their condemnation of the attacks, a lot of evidence that those Muslim community leaders were not actually reaching to and getting in touch with young Muslims, particularly young Muslim men. Now, generation gaps, there's nothing new about that, but here's a generation gap operating perhaps in a particularly disturbing and destructive way. So trying to reach out more to young Muslims. So that was the other part of the immediate response, this reaching out to Muslim communities. That's action in Britain. But as I said earlier, terrorism isn't just a British phenomenon. There have been attacks around the world, from Spain to, as we saw recently, Indonesia, from Turkey to Kenya. And part of our strategy in combating terrorism, therefore, has to be to work internationally. Part of that is extremely close cooperation between our policing and intelligence agencies, and we have no closer cooperation on that front than we do with the US, exchanging information, exchanging intelligence, and so on. There's also been significant improvements in recent months to address better action at a European Union level, including the introduction of a European arrest warrant, which allows an arrest warrant for certain crimes issued in one country to be delivered in another country in the European Union. And indeed, the first such use of those warrants was made when somebody suspected of the suspect involved in the 21 July attacks was arrested in Italy using one of these European search warrants. International action on terrorist funds, trying to stop the flow of money to terrorist centres. Again, Britain can't do it on her own, neither can the US, but the stronger international coalition we've got working on that, the more effective it is. But another part of that international agenda is trying to work on some of the issues that breed radicalisation, that give oxygen to terrorism. And that's not immediate work, it's long-term work, but just a couple of examples there. The priority that we have given to helping to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict, recognising that conflict's role over decades in giving a cause for pretext for terrorism. So working very hard to help establish a two-state solution, putting a lot of resources and help to the Palestinian Authority to try and help that along the path of becoming a viable entity. Another example, and it may sound a bit remote, but the work that Tony Blair has done this year on Africa, addressing African development needs, addressing African poverty. Well, part of that is about trying to reduce the risk of instability and conflict in that continent, instability and conflict which can itself underlie the growth of terrorist movements there. So there's that wide international agenda as well. Now, the campaign against terrorism isn't new. That's because terrorism isn't new. It's not a campaign that is limited to the UK or Europe or the US. It has to be international. As I said, in our strategy, there are many dimensions to that. There are the new legislative proposals going through the UK at the moment, the new administrative proposals to try and counter extremism. There's the outreach to the Muslim communities. There's the international strategy. But the attacks in London underlined, certainly in Britain, the reality of that threat. I think there was a sense in which, because happily there hadn't been major public attacks for a number of years, probably the public sense of the immediacy of that threat and the urgency of that threat had probably slipped down a couple of notches, and these things happen. Well, that has changed. But also I think it did underline that countering terrorism does have to be an international effort. And as I said earlier, countering that terrorist threat is an area where we work extraordinarily closely with the US. So very briefly, in fact probably not all that briefly, but anyway, briefly, I hope that gives you some idea of the response in Britain to those terrorist attacks. Can I conclude by thank you all again for listening, and but also thank everybody again, and people in Chicago, as I said, for the fantastic response we had to those attacks in London. And it's a difficult time when you know who your friends are, and we felt very much at home to them. Thank you very much.
Mr. Seaton, thanks so much for your remarks. Very well taken, very much appreciated. In this area of international cooperation, I want to just shift over from terrorism per se to proliferation. And I wonder if you could talk about the Proliferation Security Initiative, the PSI, in which the UK and the US have been working very closely for the last 4 years, and what you think are the prospects for that going forward, and whether or not it is a strong enough framework for the civilized world to meet the challenges of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction.
Thank you for that question. I mean, it's a difficult, in a sense, it's not a question you can give a a simple or straightforward answer to, because like many of these things, it's a process. There is a process underway. I think one ground for optimism and one ground for saying there's a big element of wait and see. I think the grounds for optimism comes back to something I said about the international fight against terrorism, which was, it seems to me, though I'm not an expert, it seems to me that there's been a significant increase in the international exchange of information, intelligence, on the security and intelligence nets around proliferation, which has resulted in some very significant steps forward, perhaps most significantly abroad in recent history in relation to Pakistan. I think another positive element in that, although it doesn't quite relate to that specific initiative, but is nonetheless part of the wider international strategy trying to deal with the threat posed to us all by weapons of mass destruction, is Libya. Now, if you look at what's happened in Libya, I mean, not very many years ago, Libya was pretty much #1 pariah state. I mean, completely outcast from the international community. We know it, funding a number of terrorist activities, themselves engaged in very, very determined efforts to acquire nuclear weapons and chemical weapons. And now look what's happened. You know, a conscious policy decision to re-enter the community of nations, to stop those activities, to stop that terrorist financing, to give up its programs of weapon development. Now, I mention that because, in a sense, although it's not formally part of the proliferation initiative, it nonetheless reflects that the work going on to stop weapons of mass destruction is in fact very multifaceted. And while there are some major worries around, and I'll come back to one of those, I think there's some real progress that can be seen. Clearly, I think probably the issue of the moment in that regard is in relation to Iran, where, again, there has been a process engaged in for the past 18 months, 2 years, led by the EU3, as they're called, France, Germany, and Britain, supported increasingly strongly by the US. And I think, you know, it's no particular secret when the EU3 started off down this road of trying to negotiate with the Iranian authorities to make them, or to persuade them, to come into line with their international obligations and stop reprocessing and conversion activities, that there was a lot of skepticism in the US, I suspect in part the US administration as well. But in a sense, where we are now is the US very, very firmly behind that initiative by the EU3 to try to increase international pressure on Iran to stop its nuclear weapons development program. Now, where that's going to go, frankly, is difficult to say. We've had the decision taken by the International Atomic Energy Agency, making clear the international community's view that what Iran is doing is against its international non-proliferation commitments. And the next stage, everybody presumes, will be a referral to the Security Council. But in a sense, the ball is back in the Iranian court as to how they respond to that and how they respond to that clearly expressed view by the international community. And you know, there's a political dynamic in Iran there as well. So it's not a static process. And I think there, the jury must be out on that too of the process. But again, you have seen an international process working, at least in terms of procedures as it's meant to, and exerting pressure.
Good morning, Mr. Seaton, and thank you for your comments here this morning. I have two quick questions if I could ask you. First, my name is Michael Ahern. I have a security background, intelligence background, so I want to ask you about a couple of weeks or a couple of weeks after the incident this past July. We had an incident that your country had an incident on a train where a young Brazilian immigrant was killed, and I was wondering what was the fallout internally as well as diplomatically with the government of Brazil. That's the first question.
Okay. Yeah, this was the incident that you may have read about. In fact, it was, I think, on the 22nd of July, so just a day after the attempted bombings in London, when this young Brazilian was shot in an underground station. There's not much I can say about that because, in fact, that shooting is currently being investigated by the Independent Police Complaints Commission, actually looking into the policy that surrounded that shooting, but also the operational steps that led to that incident. And it wouldn't be right for me to comment on that while it's being considered by that commission. Diplomatically, we, as a British government, has apologised formally to the Brazilian government and to the Brazilian people for that shooting, reflecting the fact that whatever the pressures of the moment, it was clearly a mistake and a tragic mistake born, I suspect, of the pressures. But that's, on the diplomatic side, in a sense, the answer is fairly, action has been taken. I'm afraid in terms of looking at actually what led up to that incident, that's still being looked at by the Complaints Commission. The second question.
Okay, thank you. The other area deals with something 4 or 5 years prior, or 4 or 5 years ago, your country had quite a challenge with mad cow disease. And I know in intelligence circles there was some concern at the time, continued to be, because of economic impact. And I'm aware that this had much more economic impact than most of us in America realized at the time. I'm wondering what your country learned from that, and what safeguards have been put in place to prevent a reoccurrence.
Yeah, the economic impact of mad cow disease was indeed devastating. An extremely expensive system was put in place to ensure, and that has worked happily so far, that there could be no recurrence of this. I think it was one of those diseases which, in a sense, slightly took people by surprise. The disease had a long gestation, and by the time it started to appear, in a sense, the causes were several years back. But in a narrow sense, what's happened now is that every cow born in Britain is tagged, has got an electronic tag on it to demonstrate that it comes from a mad cow disease herd, and that no animal can be sold at any point in the food chain unless it's traceable right back to its herd of origin. An incredibly expensive and laborious process, but one which was thought essential to restore public confidence in the food supply chain, and one which has worked. And indeed, that labelling system is now one that's being used very much by other countries in looking at similar problems in their own agriculture. But I think, just to sort of bring it back a little bit to terrorism, I think one of the areas which is in some ways related to that, which people in London are very concerned about, is indeed the use of biological and chemical agents in terrorism. Partly because of their devastating impact, partly because many of these are relatively easy to manufacture, and partly because they don't always show up in a number of the usual security precautions. And so a lot of effort going into making sure that those sorts of agents don't get into the wrong hands. And in a sense, to link up the earlier question, while there's been a lot of public attention paid to what's going on in terms of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons and so on, the other side of that agenda, which is looking at chemical and biological weapons, actually there's probably been just as much, if not more, work done internationally, but without it always hitting the headlines in the same way, reflecting the devastating impacts on societies if those sorts of weapons got into the wrong hands.
Doug Castle from Notre Dame, Mr. Consul General. What struck me as I listened to your brief description of Britain's response to the London bombings was that along the list of law enforcement, intelligence, social efforts, border controls, and so forth, was not included a military response that would suggest that the way to deal with people like the bombers is to label them enemy combatants, to lock them up for as long as you wish, wherever you wish, with no due process, no lawyers, and no courts. An approach which, as you know, has been tried in some other countries. I won't ask you to comment on any of those other countries because of the diplomatic sensitivities of your position, and city club rules. Is that true? But in any case, my question is this. Was that option surfaced at all in the debate in the UK following the London bombings? Is it something which is on the agenda? Have the police said that the additional crimes they've been given, acts preparatory, training and so forth, in the 90-day period to hold people, that all those measures in their view should be sufficient? Thank you.
Thank you, Doug, for that question. Of course, I mean, the short answer is no. I mean, specific proposals of the sort that you outlined were not, as far as I know, mentioned in any of the proposals aired in response to the London attacks. Of course, in itself, the proposal to move towards 90 days detention is seen in some quarters as a step in that direction. And that is very controversial in the UK. The High Court in the UK earlier in the year struck down a number of measures which it said breached the principle of no detention without due cause. And one of the controversies about these new measures is precisely whether this 90-day maximum detention period is too far a step in that direction of detaining people without due cause, therefore abusing normal habeas corpus rights and so on. I think it's the same sort of issue in perhaps a slightly less extreme way than the circumstance you're describing. But I think it hits to the same issues about how far can the state act without due cause in particular areas of crime and so on. And as I said in my comments, there isn't, it seems to me, there's no sort of absolute right or wrong here. You know, there is something of a sliding scale. I don't know whether that 90-day detention rule is going to stand scrutiny of the House of Commons. I would not be at all surprised if even if the legislation does come out, there'll be a challenge to our legal system. And we have checks and balances in our system just the same as do in the American Constitution. And you know, we will see how that process comes out. Just a couple of points on that. First, to bring out that the 90-day detention is not, that's not what the detention will be in each and every case. What the provisions are is that where justified, detention can be up to a maximum of 90 days. And secondly, that beyond the initial detention period, each extension has to be agreed by the judicial authorities. So the police and the prosecuting authorities can't just decide to detain someone, it has to go to a judge. So there are safeguards built into that detention period, but it's an issue which concerns a lot of people in the UK, as I said, concerned about possible erosion of human rights and so on. And that's a debate which each society has in its own ways, and you know, we'll see quite where the balancing point comes out in Britain after this.
Thanks, Adam Scheffler, independent social worker. Could you talk about the government's response currently to the avian flu epidemic threat? I know that a few days ago there was some statement that was issued that was trying to tamp down undue public speculation about the threat to Britain in particular, but what are you doing now? Because actually there's just been increasing, there's one more country every day that seems to have exposure to this, and it seems to be creeping closer to your country. What are you doing both domestically and globally on this?
I think this is an area where there is a lot, one of our main areas of activity is in fact within the European Union. I mean, there has been this outbreak of avian flu in Eastern Europe, now into Romania. And given the freedom of goods and products across the European Union, this is classically an area where one European country can't, in a sense, set up its own defences in any hope that it will secure its own borders accordingly. So there's a lot of action going at European level in terms of health inspection, in terms of controls on movement of poultry. At national level, I guess the other main focus is in terms of vaccination procedures and so on, to make sure as far as possible, though you can't just sort of turn on a tap, but to make sure as far as possible that flu vaccines are needed and establishing some sort of prioritization for access to those vaccines if supplies are limited. But I mean, it's just another example of the way, one of the great phenomena nowadays is globalization. And we talk about that in business terms, all the time. Workers in Illinois fleeing the competition from Chinese workers, Indian workers, and so on. But in a sense, this is another bit of globalization that, given the freedom of goods and movement of people around the world, health problems which, 40, 50 years ago might have stayed in China or in Romania, now are a risk to us all. So it's another way in which the domestic policy agenda and the international policy agenda are actually coming much, much closer together.
Andrew, thank you very much. Not often does the English language spoke like it is spoken, especially when we have former Illinois politicians. Here is a City Club mug, the history of the City Club, 1-year membership to the City Club in American dollars, so it isn't worth as much as you thought. For those of you who aren't members of the City Club, please join. It's a very tough membership application, $50. And we'll be seeing you all next week. We are adjourned, and if you want to see Andrew again, CAN TV is showing this sometime probably in the future. I don't know. Thank you.